My name is Jason,
My name is Connor.
and this is the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. So as we get started today, I want to pose this question. If you have, we'll be in our imaginary world for a minute, so you have all the time in the world, and you come under emotional, spiritual, mental pain. So you've got all the time in the world to process it or do whatever you want with it. There's no other obligation that would take your mind off it. You just have space of time. You've experienced this hurt. What's your first reaction? How do you process that?
So this is something where it's my favorite thing in the world when Christians get to talk about past struggles and get to talk about like, man, I used to really struggle with this. And so this is a great example of the way. This is one of those current things where it's like, yeah, this is a big struggle for me, because the first thing that happens when I come under emotional pain and I have time to process is I don't want to. I want to distract. I want to I just want to put myself in a place where I don't have to think, don't have to do the business of healing or do the business of processing or even reckoning with what happened. Usually that involves like video games and food, and I distract myself in those unhealthy ways. Honestly, that's exactly what it is. And distraction is not terrible. Sometimes when pain is so vivid, that's what's sometimes that it's so painful that you have to have the distraction. It's the same idea of like, man, like the idea of I'm holding onto someone's hand and I'm getting alcohol poured on a wound. Part of that is like I'm distracting myself from the pain. So it's not inherently bad right after the fact, but the problem for me becomes as time goes on and as life moves forward and the pain has to be addressed in some sort of way. It's the when that happens. Usually for me, I get drug. Like I have the pain, I distract myself from it, and then at some point, God does something, or maybe like my own stupidity leads me in a way where like I have to begin to think about it and have to begin to process it. And usually it comes up, and I think about myself, and I think about what I best deserve, what is most important to me, and then eventually God will convict me sometimes and make me think about others. But yeah, usually for me it's a process of distraction, then running away, and then finally when the pain is either too much or God forces it, I then begin to process. So that's for me. It's something that, and sometimes I can do it well, and others I am desperate in need of sanctification or teaching or training or just practice. And sadly, I think most of it's practice, which just means getting more and more of it, which just that kind of blows.
Mm-hmm. Right, because that means it's not ending. And
yes,
yeah, exactly. Yes. For me, it's interesting. The distraction piece is there, and you and I, for those that don't know that are listening, Connor and I have very different personalities and different ways of processing, but that distraction piece is a big piece. I think it's my second step. I think the first step is easy solution. I'm an Enneagram 7, which one of my things is I don't want to feel trapped. If I feel that tension, I look for an easy solution because I want everybody to be happy, and let's not have a lot of tension. I'm anti-tension, and so I'll go for that quick fix on, which leads me sometimes to take responsibility for things that aren't mine. It leads me to apologize for things that were my fault. But it's like, is there a quick fix? And if there's not, I start to feel trapped. And then I've got to be really careful that I don't go to really intense anger. And it may not even come out of me, but it's deep in me, and then it will always come out sideways, like my kids, my wife, my friends, whatever will catch it. And then usually I'll distract, and that actually could happen in a matter of seconds or a matter of hours, just depending on where I'm at and the situation we're talking about. Then I will distract. And a lot of times I will distract until I wake up the next morning, and I wake up with it. And then my energy hours are in morning hours. And so a lot of times I'll go write out an email or whatever, and I think it's good practice to write it out, then walk away, pray about it, maybe delete it twice, whatever, kind of thing. But yeah, I will wake up with it, and then starts the conversations in my mind. Well, what did they, I don't know, I didn't, this kind of thing. And so, and it just varies on the nature of the relationship or how important this issue is, how if I keep attending to it, I mean, there are some conversations I'm still having, and the experience happened, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, where it'll pop up and I'll have the conversation again about what I would have done or why they were wrong or what I'd apologize for or whatever, And so, yeah, I mean, I could tell you healthy ways that I'm working on it, but that's still, I don't know if it's sadly, but that's still realistically, that's the process for me.
So we'll talk about it a little bit more, I'm sure, when we get into the meat of the episode. But I'm so fascinated by how people, when they begin to do the processing and when begin to think about it and then begin to examine and look inside. So I'm very similar to you. It's always a one-way conversation. It's always this process of me imagining these conversations, imagining what I would say, how I would say it. And because of my job, where it's not super mentally taxing, I have all the time in the world. And sometimes that's a beautiful blessing, and sometimes it's just the worst curse, because I can just work myself up into a frenzy in really terrible ways. Right. And in fact, I can go to work in the morning and I can begin to process, begin to have these conversations in my mind, begin to think about, begin to really examine, and I can start out in just like the worst possible place and just like have convinced, in a really unhealthy way, convince myself that the world is falling. And then through that whole process that maybe we'll get into today, maybe we'll another day, I begin to kind of turn that over to God, and then by the end of the day, the sky's not falling, and I've examined it, and maybe the pain is healed, or I know the treatment, or I know I can see a way forward. And I'm just so fascinated by that process for me, because obviously there are points where like I can have pain and I go to God with it straight away, and I have this dialogue, if you will, and dialogue, what that means to you, it comes out different for all of us. But for me, it's usually a long process to get to that point where I can have that dialogue with God. And the story we're going to be looking at today is where we see Jesus kind of have that almost immediate turn to God. And so the passage that we're going to be talking about is in Matthew 11, towards the end of the chapter. Right before this, you'll have the famous woe to these towns, where Jesus just hammers, I don't know how else to say it, the actions and the peoples of these towns. And maybe we'll do that episode one day, although that's all perplexing, so I'd have to find some amazement somewhere in there. But we're going to be reading a little bit after that. And so, yeah, we're excited for you to join us this week.
So as Connor alluded to, we're in Matthew 11, beginning in verse 25, and I would encourage you, maybe even put a pause on the episode. How do you respond to emotional, spiritual, mental pain? It can feel like attack. It can feel like you're being neglected or abandoned, betrayed. It's really good before you do this processing to have a sense of how you do it, and ask God to just speak to you through what we share today. Beginning in verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
So, Jay.
You got in first. Good job.
So, Jason, what amazes you about this passage?
So I'm so drawn to verse 28, 29, 30. I live there a lot. I find myself quoting that a lot, both to myself and others. So I was intentionally watching for what else in this passage, though I could talk about those verses all day long. This dynamic of coming off the woes, you know what I mean? And just like verse 24, I tell you it'll be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. So these people that had seen Jesus and rejected him, he's like, it's better to be a Sodomite. And you're like, whoa, you know what I mean? That's heavy. That's deep stuff. And then to turn around and go, I praise you, Father, that's a funny dynamic. But I'm amazed at this idea of it reframes even those woes. It's like Jesus isn't mad at them. He's saying, here's the reality. Like he's not doing a mood shift here, I don't perceive. I was looking back and seeing, does it say, and Jesus, angrily, he's denouncing them, but he's not saying, I'm so mad at you. He's just saying, hey, these are some facts you got to deal with them. And I feel like he's that with the Pharisees too when he calls them whitewashed tombs. In other places, he'll say he's mad at them, but it's not he's mad. He's like, look, this is reality. And it just amazes me especially in the sense of I don't know how to do that. So I guess I don't know. I'm feeling torn. Is this what perplexes me? But it is that idea of it amazes me how he is so centered, so at peace that he can shift from this dynamic. Which if I'm in the crowd, I'm like, whoa, that's so heavy, and he's like, God, I praise you.
Yeah.
And then that idea of this isn't hard is what he's saying. And that's kind of amazing because I've always been presented that, man, Christianity is hard. You got to know the right stuff. You got to have your stuff in line. You better be getting better. You better be stepping up. I will even say to people, when I encourage people, I will find myself saying, I'm not telling you to go to the next level. And it's a safeguard in my own heart because I always felt like any encouragement I got, people are always like, I can't wait until you've really arrived. I can't wait until you're really a good Christian. I just feel like all growing up, like no matter what gift I showed, people are like, I can't wait to see where this goes. Instead of just being in that moment. And then Jesus says, no, it's simple. Like I'm telling you, they've been hidden from the complex. They've been hidden from the wise and learned. And it's for children. And he wanted this way. And that's so different than the way I received the messages of Jesus.
Sure. So for most people, when they receive condemnation, when they receive like judgment, it's because they didn't do a good enough job. It's because they weren't smart enough. They were not emotionally able to handle it. They didn't lead well enough. And Jesus will come down upon these towns, and the natural thing that most of our minds would probably click to would be that they didn't get to the level, right? They didn't get to, to the next level like you're talking about. And Jesus starts off talking about how, man, like you said, it's the simple that they didn't get right. It's the simple they didn't come to. It's the simple that, man, if we're not getting there, then we're missing it. And I think that is such a it's such a flip of the script for how my brain is wired, and I think how most people's brains are wired, to assume that when somebody's messed up, the assumption is, well, they weren't mature enough, they were not smart enough, they didn't get it. And Jesus goes, no, you messed up because you weren't like the little children, you weren't like the infants. And that is a complete rewiring of I'm trying to rewire my brain as we speak, because that is so different from how I perceive failure or how I perceive messing up. Like I think about messes up in the church, or even times when I've been hurt by the church. And I think, man, if those people have been more mature, if those people have been more this, or if and the answer for me, and yes, maturity is obviously important and good, but maybe should my first thought be, man, if they had had the faith of a little child, or if I had existed in that sort of way, or I had believed like the little children do, or I trusted, or I had faith, or they had trusted, or they had faith like the little children, that would be success. Not more smartness. Not more smartness.
That's beautiful.
I'm already getting there, Jason.
You're on your way.
Yeah, but not more cleverness, not better planning, not better execution, not the next level, but true simple. Like that is absolutely beautiful to me.
I really that is helpful to me. Even as I said, the first part, to flesh that out in my own head. And this is the thing. I think and I don't know when it changed or where I'm at on the change. Like, you know how you'll think something, but you're not really convinced of it yet. And
Sure.
You find out years later, oh, now I really believe it, but I would have said I believed it 10 years ago or whatever. But that idea of I've misunderstood the hard work of being a Christ follower. The hard work of being a Christ follower isn't, I got to know the next thing, I got to master the next skill. The hard work of being a Christ follower is to trust him like a small child, like your daughter trusts you. It's not, well, we don't know what she's thinking because she's not able to articulate it. We have some sense, based on how she communicates.
Sure.
But that idea of she trusts you that you're going to take care of her food, and she trusts you that you're going to take care of her where she's going to sleep, and when things are bothersome, she's not trying to articulate on her own, how will I solve this? It's an immediate cry to you.
Yes.
And I've perceived that as immaturity. I don't want to be a baby in the kingdom. And God's like, I need you to be a baby in the kingdom. And even now, this is resonating in my own heart and head, that the baby feels uncomfortable, the baby cries. I feel uncomfortable. I try to solve it on my own for hours, maybe years, and I'm like right there. And the question I always have that ties into this is, why? How do you get from one point to another? How do you say woe to you and they get to I praise you? And this is for, and I think the connection is
awesome.
Exactly what you said is like they missed it because they kept overanalyzing it and tried to figure it out on their own. And they basically thought themselves out of a need for God. Or we'll just leave it like that.
Sure.
And he's saying it's not so much that they didn't understand the miracles, it's that they didn't allow themselves to receive the amazement of the miracles. They didn't receive the message of the miracles.
Yeah, and so Jesus displays what we're talking about immediately. He has this frustration, or he has this. We struggle to articulate how he's feeling towards these towns, and this reality. But there's some frustration. There's sadness. There's hard. This is hard for Jesus to see this as a reality. And the first thing he does is, "I praise you, Father." Like that's the first cry of his heart after that sort of emotional turmoil, emotional pain, emotional stress, whatever it may be. And so I just love that we see this and we go, like, because for my thing, it's always been a struggle. Is, well, what does that actually look like? Right? When we hear, okay, be like the little children, or be like these, like, what does that even look like? And Jesus in this specific passage demonstrates what it is to be like, especially when we come under this emotional stress or emotional pain, and for it to be immediate reaction. Like, I think about it, it's so funny watching 𝐿𝐴𝐴, grow up, and I've seen babies do it, and I've been around babies that done it, but when it's your own kid, it's this weird new thing. But seeing how they process pain, or seeing how quickly, or who they look to, or if 𝐿𝐴𝐴 like hits her head on something, and how quickly she is just desperate to see her mother, or I mean, it's this like half a second of they're shocked, and then it's immediate. It's not even an initial thought. And like I know her well enough to know that if she's in severe pain, like if it's really, really bad, that I can't do it, and I need to take her exactly where she is, and she knows exactly who she needs. She knows exactly what will bring her comfort. And it's just so incredible to me that I had never really seen this before, that Jesus is demonstrating that relationship with the Father in this passage.
That's outstanding. Yeah, I did not see that. Is that idea, because crying out has a lot of different looks. Mm-hmm. There's sometimes he's like, "Why have you forsaken me?" And there's and he's like, "Or why won't you? Will you glorify this?" And God's like, "I have glorified it." He's like, "Oh, well, there you go." You know what I mean, kind of thing. But in this case, he's like, "I am grateful," and maybe even you think of the emotional connection. Because I was looking back, he's taught the chapter starts. He teaches the apostles. Then he's in Galilee, so he's teaching a crowd. John's disciples shows up. He answers a question. John's disciples leave. Then he's talking about John, and then he transitions to, why is he talking about this right now? He's saying, look, there's serious consequence to this. And then he follows it up, because he's not talking to the Sodomites here. He's not talking to or these unrepentant cities. He's talking to Galileans at this point, who also are struggling with not being penitent. But it's not who he's talking about. But he's immediately also giving them the answer, because if I hear, hey, if you're doing this, you're in big trouble, my instant question is, well, what can I do not to get in that trouble? And he's like, so he's talking to God, but for the sake of the people. And the reason we know that is he transitions in 28 to, hey, all of you who are weary. And that's that part. I just love putting this together, like when I don't see it before. But he's like, it would worry me if I'm a listener. And then he says, God, all you ask for is for them to be children. So I'm like, oh, yeah, I can just be a children. This worries me. And he's like, are you worried? Do you feel heavy? Well, if you're worried and heavy laden, guess what? God has a plan for that. Mm-hmm. So, but the key operative thing here is trusting God, not figuring it out.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. And I think it's one of those things, the weary part, and that gets a little bit to what amazes me. A little bit after this, almost right after this, in 12, Jesus will begin to talk about being Lord of the Sabbath, and just the way that he communicates and the way that the authors of the Gospels put it together. It's one of those things that the way we read Scripture, and even the way we do the podcast, sometimes it can feel disjointed. But man, I just love this aspect of when you begin to connect all these little dots of, like, Jesus wasn't just putting these little nuggets of wisdom. He wasn't just like, okay, and this is good. This is a good time for when you're in pain, or this is good for whenever you come under judgment, or yada yada yada, whatever it may be. There are these intricate ways that Jesus is trying to communicate to his people, and he starts at the beginning. Okay, like, I have this. There's this weirdness, this hardness with the city, and now I'm immediately turning to God, and I'm immediately praising Him, and I'm immediately crying out in this different way than maybe other times. And then you will talk about later on, talk about come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And then he goes on to talk about what that is. And he then connects it to their life, living under, he connects it to their life, and the practice of Sabbath in just a few short verses. And so, man, I'm amazed at the way that Jesus is communicating here. And it's so fascinating because it seems so simple. Like, it seems so like once you see it, it's so obvious. But before, I just kind of ran over this passage and been like, oh, well, Jesus is just saying some words. He's talking about being connected. Like, it doesn't, sometimes like you read these things, like when I first thought of this passage of doing it, I was kind of like, well, like 25 and 20 through 27 don't really seem super connected to verses 28 and 29, but we'll just do it because it's fun. But now I'm seeing, man, there is this connection of, there is this connection of the crying out, of the connection of who Jesus is and the rest that he offers. And so, yeah, all of what we just said was amazing to me in summation.
So with that in mind, and honestly, there's so much of this, I'm like, this perplexes me, and then there's an amazing side to it. There is this perplexing piece about his, I don't quite know, you just said, I see the connection, and I do too now, but 27, it's a very interesting thing, because he'll do this periodically, where he'll say, nobody knows God but me, and God, that whole idea, I've got this special knowledge, which is meant to do something, and my weak guess, I don't know, maybe it's a good guess, I don't know, is this idea that he includes us in the middle of this to remind them who he is, or it's this weird thing. I don't perceive it as arrogance because I start with the bias that he's not arrogant, but it is this weird, why is this needed here? But he'll make these assertions sometimes that, I don't know, I guess if they're not in the Bible, I wouldn't think about it. And because I have read it in other places, then it seems almost redundant. And I can't tell you if this is 4 times it shows up in Scripture or 20 times it shows up in Scripture. But this idea of his insistence on saying, there are so many, here's what it is. There are so many times where he's like, don't tell people. There are so many times where he's like, so humble. You know what I mean? And this, if this was in any other context, now obviously be blasphemy, that too. Let's make this corollary. Like if there was somebody that was universally respected and I knew them very well, and I'm talking to you and I stop in the middle and say, hey, you don't know Superstar like I know Superstar. And pretty much if you hear me speaking, I'm Superstar. It's this interesting dynamic, and I spin it immediately in my head that it's Jesus humble, he emptied himself of God.
Sure.
So it is this, I imagine it's to, like, are you doubting? Do you sense they're doubting here? Like, why here? And it's just this odd dynamic to assert his identity. It's just, to me, it feels off.
For sure. I don't know the answer, but I wonder if it could connect back to kind of what amazed me. I think very much for me right now, and probably for the disciples hearing this, the thing that Jesus teaches right before this is so different from how they viewed everything, right? Like, I mean, they viewed the Pharisees, they viewed the people who knew the Torah the best. They viewed those people as the ones that God truly honored and blessed, and those were the end people. Those are the people at the next level. And Jesus comes in and says, no, like it's the children have picked up on the things that these people have missed, and it's such a, I use the word rewiring. And so I wonder, is that like okay, I have this trust for this person. I like earlier in the chapter, you have, John is questioning, is Jesus who he says he is, or who I believed him to be in the past. I'm struggling with this. Is this Jesus recognizing in the moment that like, I have revealed something about the nature of things that is counterintuitive, not just to the Jewish religion, but all ways of thinking, is counterintuitive to almost everything that they would have an example for in their culture.
Right.
And so is that an example of Jesus, of recognizing how difficult and how complex this simple teaching is. And it's a call to be like, hey, like I get it. I know it's hard, but like, this is why. Here's why you can trust us. Here's why you can have faith in it. I don't know. Yeah. That could be a piece of it.
No, I love that. I love that thought, and I don't know, but I can see what you're saying, that this would be, and this, I would love if there was like the self-talk of the apostles written that we discovered, like as they're hearing this, is Thaddeus going, that ain't right. That ain't, oh yeah, he is God. Yeah, okay, maybe. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, exactly. And so, but he knew what they needed. And that's where my confidence lies, is he's sharing this intentionally. Even this idea of the kids, when I was reading exactly like you were. I'm like, this is almost throwaway passages. And then when I dig into it and consider the context, I'm like, oh, this is groundbreaking. And what you just said there about this is the opposite of every pursuit you've ever had. every pursuit you've ever, I don't care if it's learning an instrument or studying a language, if you get 5 years down the road and they still say you're a baby in the process, that is not a compliment. That's like, give up, And so, and there is maturity, but maturity is trusting more in God, not having your own ability to reason things out or know the right answers. And that is so not just counterintuitive, but counter everything I think of when I think about growing in Christ. Usually I think of I'm amassing my ability to think like God, and I don't finish that sentence, but honestly the finish is, so I will need him less.
That's fascinating. So, okay, so this is, and I might have this right, I might have this wrong. So like if you've spent any time around church, like you've probably been told when Jesus refers to his yoke, what that means. And so I'm wondering here, I've always been kind of confused by this. This was what perplexed me at first. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. If you haven't heard what a yoke is, a yoke would be, I said yoke, a yoke would be it's the teaching, it's the way of living, it's the belief system, it's the everything of a rabbi, and his students would take upon the yoke of the rabbi, take upon the teachings. Like, is that to your understanding?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, and it came from a real dynamic it's a agricultural or farming dynamic. But yeah, absolutely,
for sure. So when Jesus says, take this upon you, for me, I think about the thing that perplexed me is for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So like, okay, what aspect of the pursuit of Jesus is easy and light? So, because like at first glance for me, the answer would be nothing. Like absolutely nothing. Like it's so, man, the death to self, the picking up your cross. Man, there's so much that is so difficult and so hard, and can feel very burdensome. But then I get, okay, why is this little aside? Why is this sentence here mixed in right after what we read before? And is this part of, so when Jesus talks about his yoke, his teaching, his way of doing things, is he saying like, listen, like he's not speaking directly to the necessarily dying to yourself, but like, listen, the process of knowing what to do, the beginning of it all is easy. And for you, the stress of figuring out what is next, figuring out the next level, figuring out how you're supposed to work all these things out, man, that is a heavy burden. That is, these rabbis have spent years studying the Torah, have spent years talking and processing. And man, if you begin to try to learn all that, begin to try to apply that in every single situation and understand it completely, man, it'll feel so burdensome. But for me, I'm telling you that my yoke is one that is inherently carried by children. It is inherently the cry of the total trust and total faith in the Creator and in your Father. And so, man, I'm processing out loud what this means to me, because it seemed kind of separate. And I've struggled with it in the past too, because Jesus brings me so much joy and so much love and so much life. But sometimes, man, a lot of times it's really freaking hard to be a follower of Jesus. And okay, so how does he give us rest? How does he lessen our burden when we're dying to self, when we're taking up our cross and following him daily? And the answer is taking up your cross and following him daily and dying to ourself. The hard part is it goes against everything that that the world is telling us to be, and the easy part is that it's ingrained in the infants. And I'm trying to verbalize it here, but it is the easiest way, in that it requires the least amount of figuring it out yourself. Okay, did I kind of wrap it up?
Yeah, that's it. You got there. I think that I keep thinking about this baby, like literally thinking about a baby and how you deal with a baby. Is it hard to be a baby? What makes it hard to be a baby is the expectation that you won't be a baby. Like for the baby's like, yeah, I had an accident, you clean this up. I need food, you give it to me. You know what I mean? And the role of being the baby is, like we say, it's so hard to be a baby because they're crying. No, that's just, they're uncomfortable, they cry. Yeah. And they keep crying until you meet their need, and then they're fine. And if God didn't bring this up, we would think this is really self-centered or this kind of thing. But in the middle of condemning people for not responding right to God, he then says, here's how you respond right. And he uses the baby picture, and then he uses the picture of, come to me. Basically, he doesn't say this a lot. Your yoke is wrong. You're under a different yoke. And then that's like almost an identity crisis for me. I'm like, maybe I'm doing all this wrong. Like, I don't know if I look much like a baby. Matter of fact, I think people think I'm really mature. And then I'm like, I don't even know. Like, it's going to take me 3 podcasts to process it because I only process out loud, right? But it is that idea of this is why I love doing this. For me, it's like I had a thought 30 minutes ago and I have a whole different thought now. And it's hopeful, but it's perplexing. It's challenging.
So my daughter, she's almost 9 months old now. And if you've had a child, you will know that there's this outside pressure and pressure from yourself of like, is my kid meeting all these developmental milestones? Are they beginning to babble when they're supposed to babble? Are they crawling when they're supposed to crawl? Do they start to form? Like there's a whole thing. And I've made this joke several times to people, so anybody who's heard in real life will not think it's funny, but you might think it's funny. It's legitimately like you'll go to a website and you'll be like, what's the developmental milestone, the expectation for a 9-month-old? And you'll have one that's like, listen, if they look like they want to crawl, if they make a few babble sounds, they're doing fantastic. It's great. If they don't crawl for a few, it's fine. Like it's beautiful. You go to the next website and be like, listen, if your child doesn't have a job at 9 months, you're a failure and you're a terrible parent and you should feel bad. And it's an exaggeration, but it's honestly not. I've seen like in the same, like right, like on a Google search, seen that first example. And then the next click that I make is like, yeah, if your kid is not pulling up and begin like, it happens. It's very real. And I struggle so much because, I'll see my daughter make these hit these developmental milestones and begin to learn and begin to process and begin to like see how she's putting things together. And she's not worried at all about when she's going to figure out how to walk, or she's not worried at all when she hits that next milestone. She's just like, oh, like I really want that thing across the room. And so I'm going to try to pull myself to it, not so that I can hit a milestone, not so I can hit some arbitrary level, but because I need this thing and I want to get there. And so I'm just going to work on it. And so much of the pressure, I feel like, for kids as they get older is the parents have this idea of, well, you need to get to this next level. You need to get to this next place. And for a baby, they grow, right? They mature, they develop, but it's not for the sake of growing and maturing and developing. It's because they're actually learning these new useful things that mean something to them, not because of some arbitrary thing that we think is important. It's for their survival, for their growth. And for me, I'm thinking about the process of when does your child no longer become a baby? When does your child become an adult? When do they become a teenager? When do they become an adult? And we put these labels on what it is, and so much of the time it's to make ourselves feel better, right? Like if my daughter doesn't start crawling when she's supposed to, could there be a problem that needs to be addressed? Of course there could be a problem that needs to be addressed. But am I worried about it because of what I think, or because of what society tells me I'm supposed to feel about this, or because of what the parents with kids that were born right around the same time are telling me? That's usually where it comes from. And I can tell you, Indigo is not feeling any stress or embarrassment because she hasn't reached that quote unquote next level. I mean, she's just living and existing, and she's just working at her own pace, working to her needs. And so, yeah, for me, I'm just wondering here, when we talk about what it is to be like these children, to be like an infant, to be like a baby, is so much like, are we discipling our children out of this mindset when we begin to put all these expectations, begin to put on all these levels that they have to meet? Like, are we from the very beginning discipling them out of this mindset that Jesus is calling us to?
That just so good. When do they stop being a baby? That right there. I mean, I'm going to be processing that. When did I stop being a baby? How do I get back to being a baby? And if you think about it, the milestones are all about comparison. I'm not saying there's no science, but it's literally out of 7 billion children born,
Sure.
then this much, and then we kind of extrapolated that out to ongoing progress. It's funny. I've just realized this about me, and I think most God-believing people. We love the thought of intelligent design, but we don't validate difference in design. So whoever's the loudest voice in my world, they're who I need to be raising, becoming like more and more.
Yeah.
And I'm not against providing good example, but we see it in babies. There's a lot of freedom to say, okay, here's the conventional wisdom, but I also know God designed this child unique. And so I'm more talking to God about the development of this child than I am to these comparative elements because he's the designer. And I think it's the truth of us. Why do I think it's the person that has all the doctrinal answers correct? They're the mature, because that's what I've been told, because that's a comparison, And you'll find people that are very anti church gathering, for themselves, and often it'll be like, I found more loving people out of church than in church. And I'm saying, yeah. I mean, I can see that. And one of the reasons is church attendance validates consistency. Church attendance validating doing it the right way, thinking the right way, historically. Not every church. I'm just saying church attendance usually does. And or even being part of a church, you could say, involves those things. Or if you think differently, don't mention it, And so you could see how people that their personalities, their life experience doesn't lead them to tie into those values, how they would disconnect from organized religion and yet carry a lot of love. Now, I want to state unequivocally that Jesus said, if you're in Christ, you're going to seek community. Because I want you, John 17, to be like the Spirit and I and have intimacy that defies all the things that would separate us, But in terms of organized church, I really get it, that every organized church defines maturity a little bit differently. But a lot of times it comes down to, do you do the right things as we define right things, instead of do you function in the design that God created you in to show love to God and to others. And those sometimes are the same thing. But when they're not, I can see why people will be like, I don't need this, because it doesn't respect the design that God even created in me.
If I see somebody who is living out this mindset and living out this calling to be more baby-like, to be more infant-like, to cry out to God, for that to be the first thing when pain happens, for that to be the first thing when you need a need met. When I see somebody like this, it is going to be probably very frustrating for me, because when my daughter acts that way, I love her more than anything else in the world, but it can be frustrating. It can be hard because I just want the problems to be solved. I just want the things to be taken care of. And the thing for me that I'm going to try to remind myself of going forward, man, there's a line here that I'm trying to get that I can't get. And I'll probably just not end up putting it in because I don't want to go through the trouble of editing it. But yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking to myself of how can I get to this myself? How can I take on this easy yoke and this lighter burden? But then also, man, what is it going to be like if I actually encounter it? Is it going to be frustrating? Because for me, I love my daughter more than anything, and I love being around her. I love living with her. I love getting to teach her and show her things, but it can be so frustrating when she doesn't fit into my box. It can be so frustrating when she doesn't do things according to the plan, or when she's still crying out for me, even though we think we've solved all the problems. It can be really hard when a baby doesn't fit into how you've said they're supposed to fit in. And so for me, I'm just going to try to be open to the idea of, man, people who are really living this out, it might be really frustrating to me, and there might be people that I've written off before that have lived this way because I've lived this way and I just didn't see it. And so I'm just going to be processing that the next week of, how do I get this? And are there people out there that are currently living this way that I've overlooked?
One thing when we apply this passage or any concept from Bible, but specifically this concept of you're the baby, you only have one father. And this one thing we have to remember in community is, I cry out to God, but I don't necessarily cry out to Connor in the same way. I don't make Connor responsible for my babiness. I'm only making God responsible for my babiness. And this is a challenge of how do we do this together, because some might hear the concept we're sharing and think, I need to cry out. A baby cries out until they get their needs met. And a baby, like if mom and dad isn't around, well, obviously they prefer them, but the babysitter, if they're meeting that need, okay, they'll eventually accept it. You know what I mean? If they're an alternative. We have one father in this case. And I think that's one of the things that maybe derails the healthiness of us being babies to God or little children to God, is that I start with God, but then I make you responsible for me. I make my spouse responsible for me, or my church leadership responsible for me. And that's where it starts to get unhealthy, And so this is, I don't know if it's a safeguard or however you think about this, but we have to keep saying, I'm a baby to God. I'm a sibling to everybody else. I'm a grown adult sibling to everybody else. And so this functions differently. So I don't know if that would speak to anything that anybody's hearing, but that idea, because I confuse it all the time. I've had people say, don't let your wife become the Holy Spirit to you, because then you put way too much pressure on her. Well, I feel sometimes people put way too much pressure on me because I'm a minister or even just a brother in Christ. And I need to be better about saying, hey, you're on the right track, but that goes to God. Even if I have some answers, that goes to God.
Sure. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle to adapt to this sort of way, because at some point in their life, they cried out to their parents, or they cried out to their spouse, they cried out to their friends, they cried out to their church, and they didn't get their needs met, and they were abandoned, and they were left alone, or their needs were met in the exact wrong way. And so the idea of giving yourself up in that way, to be vulnerable in that way, is so painful because you were abandoned in the past. And that's where the difference comes. It's like, if you cry out to your spouse, maybe a few times, first few times they'll respond perfectly and really well, and they'll keep doing it. Eventually they're going to let you down. Eventually your church is going to let you down. And so the distinction becomes is, we've all at some point been let down when we called out for help, when we cried out for help. But the firm belief that we have to have is that when we're truly calling out to God, not our spouse, not our sibling, not our friends, or not even our church, that God will respond in kind. God will meet our needs, and that's where that belief comes from. And it's obviously incredibly hard and incredibly difficult, but also easy and light. Grace, peace, and love.